All right, we are recording, and I couldn't be more excited for this exact reason. We just wrote this down. Hi, I'm Ben Fellows, and I'm a tester.
Hello, my name is Ben Fellows and I'm a tester.
And we are the example of when multiple dimensions accidentally crash into each other, and it turns out there are multiple Ben Fellows in multiple dimensions that each do testing. And we
Yes.
felt like we had to have this conversation. So, Ben Fellows, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me.
Thank you, Ben Fellows, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Um, while I do want to spend the next 20 minutes just completely mind blown over the fact that actually, and we were saying this, some people have said, oh, are you the Ben Fellows? And not that I don't know that we've ever
Yeah.
truly been mixed up for each other, but I have had some people go, oh, I know there's another Ben Fellows who does QA, and I was always just like, that's really
Yeah.
weird. And then we came across each other on LinkedIn, I think, somehow, and that's how we ended up connected.
Actually, yeah, the first time that I heard about you was when I think I was confused for you. It was actually Richard Bradshaw from the Ministry of Testing asking if I'd signed up for this automation in testing course. That's what it was. And I was like, well, it's a very good course. I've not done it myself, but I've always been interested in it. So did I accidentally sign up in my sleep and not realise? But yeah, eventually we worked out it was a different person, I think, when it was connected to Loop and that kind of thing. I was like, oh, I've got a name twin who also works in testing. So that's when I
Yeah.
first heard about you. And then, yeah, it was later on I came across each other on LinkedIn and stuff. So I think, yeah,
I remember
amazing.
just like, I remember telling everyone in my life, like, oh my God, there's another Ben Fellows who's not just like another Ben Fellows, but he does QA and he does testing.
Yeah.
And yeah, a lot of parallels. Well, so thank you for joining. Quick things about your background. So you've been in QA and testing now for it looks like a handful of years. You are a test coach at CELCAT. Before that, you
hmm
were a test analyst. And before that, it looks like even in the education system, I'm curious to understand kind of your path into how you got into testing. But just to set the stage for this conversation, today we really want to focus on conversations around risk and how you assess risk, think about risk. And Ben, you have a lot of, God, that's going to be weird. I'm going to get over that. But you have a lot of feelings on risk. We also want to talk a little bit about manual testing, which I haven't spent a ton of time talking about on this channel, which I really appreciate, as well as how it relates to automation. Maybe even talk at the end a little bit about ChatGPT. But first off, anything about your background that I missed, or how did you get exposed to testing? How did you get into this industry?
So I think my story is fairly common. Like a lot of people, they somehow fell into testing, usually from other kind of industries as well. So I started off working IT support for various companies and organizations. And then someone found my CV online and asked if I'd be interested in applying for a software testing job, which my CV wasn't really geared towards that at the time. And I never even heard of software testing as a career, really, but it interested me enough to apply for it and see what happens. Yeah, needless to say, I got the job, and from that point on, I've been in this industry ever since, and yeah, I've been loving it.
Well,
And
and your
yeah,
name is
started
Ben
as a QA.
Fellows,
Yeah,
so I mean, any Ben Fellows in the world ends up apparently have to being in testing. So
it seems
uh,
that way. Yeah, yeah,
th-
absolutely.
that is actually, I think, the most common story around QA, because at least in the states we have no 4-year degrees around QA. We have very little
No,
institutional feeder system into QA. And
no
I'm
entry
curious,
point
in the
really.
UK, is that any different, or is there any kind of actually institutional education, or is it all just kind of smaller kind of certification programs, stuff like that?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much the same thing. I don't
Okay.
know any degree programs. I think there's a few apprenticeships now which focus on software testing, but in terms of degrees and things like that, there's nothing like that for software testing as a speciality.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's no clear entry point I'm aware of at the moment.
Yeah, no, it's very similar. So set the stage a little bit, because I'm really interested about risk. Walk me through, what does risk mean to you? Kind of what are your feelings on risk? Risk is one of the most, I think, weirdly overlooked aspects of QA, even though so much of QA is about risk. I think people jump to the testing portion of testing too fast sometimes, as opposed to first going through risk. So walk me through what risk means to you, kind of, and where you want to take some of this conversation. What are some of the interesting points of it for yourself?
Yeah, so for me, risk is all about thinking what could go wrong, what disasters could happen, how is someone going to come to loss or harm because of your software application. I think a lot of times in software testing, there is a large focus on verification and validation, which is making sure the program does what we think it should do. There's not necessarily that broader thinking about, you know, okay, we verified it does what it's meant to do, but what else could go wrong here? So you're kind of starting off with that kind of hypothesizing, this catastrophizing in a way, and then building upon that to help guide your testing. So it's kind of like a way of focusing your testing on the things that really matter the most. So once you've got an idea of risk, to take an example of like a driverless taxi, which is an example I use quite a lot. Okay, we can verify that it will pick up you up at a certain destination, it will drive you to that destination and then drop you off. We can verify that functionality. But okay, what can actually go wrong here? What would happen if it veers off course or it gets lost or it can't reach you at a certain destination? So we're thinking about all these things that could go wrong, and then we take that and try to prove the risk. Not prove the software works, but try and prove that the risk can come about, can happen, and really cause loss, value, or harm to someone. That's the whole kind of premise around risk.
And when you think about risk, do you think about sort of risk purely, or are you also thinking about effort when it comes to risk? Because when it comes to automation specifically, there's often this idea of mitigate the most risk with the least amount of effort. When you start off by thinking about risk, do you put effort aside and just evaluate risk, or are you also thinking about effort as kind of part of that process?
I think in the beginning, we just start by brainstorming all the worst things that could possibly happen. And then once we got that kind of mind map, that kind of idea in place, see, it can be quite a bit of a fun game. It's always good to speak to stakeholders as well, like ask them what their worst possible scenario is. So, for example, you could speak to a product owner and say, if you came into work tomorrow, what's the worst possible thing that you could be met with? What's the worst message that someone could give you? And they'll be like, oh, okay, our systems go down, or there's a massive data leak, something like that. So they know these risks. They'll give you those risks right off the bat. But once they've got those ideas in place, then we'll start to break them down and say, okay, how realistic are these risks? How valid are they? What do we need to test these? How long are we going to take to test these? What's the likelihood of them actually going to happen? What's the impact? So we're starting to, from that point, build up a test plan around these areas of risk then, and to go on from there.
So do you maintain those risks in a documented way in kind of a repository and then revisit that over time separate than the test plan, or are risks built into the test plan? Like when you start off with this list, is it something that you as a being a part of a project come back to, and you actually have these all written out somewhere in a way that is like, okay, this is a scope of risks almost?
Yeah, that's exactly it. We have it counts as a risk scope, and we can assess our testing against that scope then. With automation, you talk about automation coverage quite a lot. Well, another kind of coverage model is a risk scope model. So we can, have we covered all the risk that we wanted to cover? And that's stored in a document. It's kind of part of the test plan. And then we can, come back and revisit that document later on if we need to see if the risks are still valid. As part of a regression testing approach, we can revisit those risks as well. So, what risks
Okay.
do we want to rerun again? What do we think's what wasn't so important before? What risk may be more important now? Because software and context changes over time. So all these documents, all these mind maps, all these list of risks, we do have archived and we do go back to them, definitely.
And you also probably can take that to stakeholders too in a way that's really explicit about, okay, this is the risks that we have covered, and then ultimately sort of make sure that you get alignment within the entire organization about kind of, okay, these are risks that ultimately are risks, but maybe they're such edge cases that we have to have a conversation about kind of effort to cover them.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's and I can imagine that's a fun game. As a QA human or a tester, excuse me, we were talking a little bit about the terminology. One of the fun but sort of drastic things about the job is thinking about all of the things that could go wrong, right? And sort of
Yeah.
having fun thinking about, okay, like how could we break this, or how would this be used? And I came from actually a product at one point that was being used in schools, and so many of the risks actually for us were really hard to know because so many of the risks were kind of broad in the sense of like, okay, there's a lot of infrastructure in a school that we can't control. You have your network settings, you have security settings, you have all these things. So these risks were
Yep.
really unknown. Walk me through the discovery process when you guys come up with, like, let's take this as an example. Like, okay, this is going to be deployed in a school network. A lot of these risks are, will this even work in the school network? Do you guys try to then, how do you go proving out what is a risk and what is not a risk? What's that process look like?
So I think you kind of got the right idea before when you would go and speak to the people who will be affected by these. So you've got the product owner. If you can speak to the customers themselves, that'd be a good one. So you very much want to identify the people that are going to be affected by these risks to begin with. So at the school, you've got staff, you've got students, you've got members of the public, maybe which come along. We've also got governmental organisations, um, especially when there's education involved. There may be some government regulations you have to adhere to, so there's risk that you may fall foul of them. So the more people that you speak to, and the more consensus that you get, I think the better and more broad idea you have of risk. It's all about communication and collaboration on them together, I think. But there's always going to be the unknown risk, the bugs that may happen that you're not necessarily aware of. So for every type of risk-based testing you do, you also have to do non-risk-based testing as well to discover more risks that you may not necessarily been aware of in the first place. So typically, once we've come up with a risk plan, I would then start by putting that risk plan to one side, forget about it for the moment, and then just explore the problem space and the software and the context which is going to be used by itself to see if I can uncover any more risk. Just from interacting with the application, trying to uncover bugs. Once you've observed something which may be questionable, you can say, okay, so what's the risk associated with this bug? Is that going to be a serious one? And then you may uncover more risk from that point onwards, and then you can add that back to your risk map, and then again, you've got another risk you can explore even more from then on.
So, in a broad sense, a very simplified way would be exploratory testing, right? Just sort of, as far as I'm understanding it, sort of starting to grab some yarn,
Yeah,
seeing where it goes, letting your mind kind of not necessarily always be hyper focused on risk, but instead just kind of see where the app takes you in some ways and see how you can break it.
absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
exploratory testing is about exploring new risk they haven't previously considered as much as anything else. I would, yeah, completely agree
That's
with that.
interesting. I think people tend to structure exploratory testing too much in a risk-oriented mindset. They trap their own brain in thinking about exploratory testing, but
Yeah.
still focused on risks as opposed to exploratory testing as an educational opportunity. So
Yeah.
walk me through then applying this to manual testing, automation testing. So we've talked about you build out this risk scope model, you then build test plans from it. What are some of the decisions that show up when it comes to then applying manual testing, automation testing? What's the next step here?
So once you've got the risks in place, you may want to start by testing some of the more serious risks. If you've got a risk for data loss, the customer will end up losing lots of data in production. You can then think, okay, so we need to focus on running the kind of tests that can prove this can happen. So a lot of the time, you can use the power of automation in particular to help this kind of risk-based testing by, okay, so how to best describe this, I think. So say if you've got a database which has it's guarded by access rights, okay, you want to start exploring around those access rights in particular. So you want to fire up the app, you want to have a look at the different access rights. Okay, you can verify that if you've only got view access to a particular database, you want to verify that you can only view those records only. But how about you start exploring the API as well? Because you want to try and find a way of getting around that. So I'll start exploring the API, see if I can bypass it then. I'll start thinking, okay, can I glean data or change data that I'm only supposed to have view access via another means? So you've got the thing that you're testing here. What other ways can you find a way of getting around that in a way? So you're always trying to prove that risk at that point. But you can also leverage the power of automation in this kind of testing as well. So not necessarily you're going to use automation in just version regression, but you can also use automation in a way of helping you to do further exploratory testing. So how about I start to hammer the system with lots of requests, and see if the access rights fails at one point or it dumps a load of data from the server somewhere that you can then grab. I think there's something called volume automation there.
Okay.
So that's always a good approach. So it's not just necessarily using the power of automation in the traditional sense, but also in the new kind of exploratory sense as well.
So in your day to day,
I'm
when
not
you
sure I've
think
explained
about
that too well, but yeah.
no, it made total sense, and it actually leads me right into I think one of the really big challenges that QA have, which is kind of the infinite nature of risk in some ways, right? Like what you just described was a single, fairly specific problem that you basically in 2 seconds came up with almost 4 or 5 ways of either having to test, and each of those are not necessarily simple. They're straightforward, but they can take some time.
hmm
When you think about applying risk and these risk scope models to the real world constraints of, you might have a team of 2 or 3 QA or testers, excuse me. You might have timelines and turnarounds. What are some of the rules of thumbs that you've come up with in your career for determining the ratio of how much risk to cover versus sort of effort to put in? And I would imagine it goes beyond just try to do as much as fast as possible, right? There has to be some more scientific ways of thinking about risk and thinking about what and how and where you're spending your time.
So we will sometimes do test sessions. So for any given risk, you would have a charter, which is explore some aspect of the application using some kind of approach or tool to uncover a bug related to a specific risk. And so depending on the impact and likelihood evaluation of that risk, the more serious the risk, the more time we'll spend, time box time we'll spend on that risk. So say we've got risk A, there's a risk of data loss in production. That's quite a serious risk. We're going to create 3 test sessions on that. Each of them are going to be an hour-long time box session where we're just going to explore around that issue and see what we can come up with. And by the end of the session, we'll report back, okay, what have we found out? Have we found any good bugs that need to report? Are we generally happy with the kind of amount of testing we've done against that risk? Should we create another session to test even more on that risk, or should we move on to another risk? Depending on the length of your sprint or the length of the time you've got, you can have more test sessions in there, or the shorter the session, the shorter the sprint, the fewer sessions you can have in there. And at the end of the sprint, you can just say, okay, are we happy with how much time we've spent against this risk? Should we spend more? Should we release? Or is there more development time needed to fix bugs? So you're kind of making an ongoing assessment at each point.
And how often do you find yourself from shifting QA to the left is such a hot term right now. How often do you find yourself trying to talk to developers about ways to mitigate risk before it ends up in front of you, or just thinking about data loss, or thinking about the fact of if this does go wrong, what protections do you have in place to be able to restore the database? Are you backing it up every hour? Are you backing it up every day? Like, are you having those conversations as QA, or do you have a different philosophy about that when it comes to risk mitigation earlier in the development pipeline?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of this risk planning, risk-based testing, and designs around that happens very early on in the development lifecycle. We don't wait until the software has been coded and a build has been produced before we start doing this. This will happen during the requirements or user story gathering stage. So developers can mitigate some of these risks at the beginning. IT operations people can put processes in place if they think there's a bad enough risk there that we will need to do database restores. We can make sure that's in place. So it's not just necessarily just about testing and just about uncovering these risks, but also mitigating them throughout the software development lifecycle as well. Absolutely.
And so let's assume that there's maybe a tester listening to this, and this is something that their organization's not particularly doing effectively. Can you give any words of advice on how a tester could help sell their organization in thinking this way and advising their sort of, did you find it hard to get your organizations in the past on board with this style of thinking, or what are some of the main themes or ways that they might be able to present this as a value add, or why they should be thinking about it? Because one of the things that I found in QA, and I'll hedge my own question, is more and more I hear QA people starting to believe in their own voice, but because of sort of the nature of our industry, for a long time it was just kind of like, nope, you're at the end, you get the output. And what advice would you give for having a tester be able to pitch their organization on this style of thinking, and how would they do that?
I would say you want to have a constant vision of how you want testing or QA to happen in your organization, and you want to be constantly communicating that vision to the rest of the team. I think persistence has got to be a big part of it. You've got to be persistent and consistent with your vision. So if you want to be involved earlier on in the software development lifecycle, you know, have that idea, communicate that to the rest of your team and to the managers at every single opportunity. Oh, there's a design meeting going on. Can I get an invite to that? You're talking to the product owner as part of a user story refinement session. Can I also get an invite to that as well? Even if you have to force your way into meetings sometimes, I think it's a good way to do it. But a lot of the time, the tester can be mostly passive anyway, or seeing that they're not contributing much. But that's not necessarily true, because you're there thinking about risk the entire time you're there. You're taking notes. When I'm sat in a user story refinement session, I'm building up my risk mind map right then and there. And then after the meeting, I can then share it with the rest of the team. Hi guys, I've come up with these risks. What do you think? And you normally find that, especially if your risks are not necessarily what some people in the team would consider to be the correct risks, people will jump in to give their own suggestions and correct you. So, yeah, share what you've got, invite the rest of the team to contribute to them. Almost all of the time, they'll be happy to do so.
I'll admit that I think I've annoyed a number of product managers in my past with just, what about this? What about this? What about this? It sounds like you're a little bit more willing to be methodical, whereas I'm in the moment just being like, this utopian vision of this person doing this that you're painting is very nice, but what happens if this? What happens if this? And I think sometimes in those meetings, I don't do a particularly good job about sort of like gathering the thoughts, and instead just almost dropping grenades on their vision of it. And so I would imagine that, to your point, there's a smoother way than that, probably.
No, I think your approach is absolutely valid as well. It kind of depends on the tester at the time. You want to be there challenging people's ideas and asking these questions. I've often said software testers are professional question askers, especially the awkward questions, because now's the time to ask them. Testers aren't there thinking about how the solution should work or how the problem should be solved. Testers are there to think about how the solution is not going to work and how the problem won't be solved. It's kind of the opposite thinking. So I would absolutely advocate for that during the sessions as well. But if you're not that kind of person, or you're a bit worried to speak out, you can be totally passive, gather your questions and ask afterwards as well. Which, I mean, I'm an introvert. I'm more than happy to say that. So I kind of find that approach the best, but I'm more than happy to speak up if I feel it's needed.
Yeah. No, I'm an extroverted introvert, so I do that, and then afterwards I want to go find a dark hole somewhere, and I have tremendous anxiety about the choices I made. So in the last couple minutes of this conversation, I wanted to talk a little bit about, we've talked about risk, we've talked a little bit about manual testing and automation, even though I think that topic is one that we could definitely explore. When you and I first got on, I talked a little bit about ChatGPT and some of the impacts it's having on the industry. It's already having some major impacts across a whole number of industries. Curious to get your thoughts on it. Curious to get your thoughts on about idea generation, test planning, some of the other uses of it. Do you see it as part of our future? Do you feel like it's a sort of more of a fad? I certainly have my own opinions on it, but just want to hear another tester's opinions.
It's been interesting to use ChatGPT as part of this testing process that we go through. So one of the things I've been trying out GPT for is to...
It's hard to say. I always say GPT,
it is.
but...
Is GPT, isn't it? Yeah, I think so. OpenAI, let's call it that. So this process of generating risk, generating a quality assessment, generating test ideas, and even generating automated tests that can be written, it's interesting to go through that process in ChatGPT and see what it comes out with. So one of the things I've been doing quite a lot is giving this application, such as a driverless taxi or a Canada application like Google Canada, given this application, what are the main ways that we can assess its quality? And it will come back with some good things like it's got to be accurate in its times, it's got to allow you to create events, or for the taxi, it's got to be able to pick you up and drop you off at a destination. So all different ways of assessing its quality. And from there, I would say, okay, given these quality assessments, what are the main risks? And it'll come back with some risk ideas of how to test that. And say, okay, given this risk, what would be some test ideas to test that? And then again, it'll come back with some interesting test ideas. And then finally, could you write an automated check or an automated test for one of these ideas? And then, it'll generate some code in C#. I mean, it does come up with some good ideas, but one of the things, I've just got got an example here next to me. One of the things it came up with risks for a driverless taxi, it says, okay, by considering these factors, one can have a comprehensive evaluation of the risks of a driverless taxi. I'm thinking, okay, you've come up with 5 or 6 risks, but I wouldn't call that comprehensive by any means. If you're talking about something that's going to be that safety critical, I would not rely on that to give me a comprehensive set of risks for that at all. It's good to help generate ideas, but you still very much need a tester, I think, to get involved, as the rest of the team, to help assess and properly come up with a risk map that's agreed by everyone in the project team.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo those thoughts. I think that my experience is it kind of helps with the QA version of writer's block in some ways, where it's just like, hey, give me some different ways of thinking, but it's certainly only as good as the person using it. And I think the biggest concern that I read of people saying, oh, it's not any good, is people who think you're going to take everything it says at face value. And if you go in saying, arguably 20 to 40 to maybe even 60% of what it says going to be either wrong or not helpful, but that 40% or 50% is a new way of looking at the world with a tool that I would not have been able to look at the world in that way. And idea generation, like you say, it's really
brainstorming and stuff.
Exactly, been helpful in that. In the code end, I've been, sometimes it does great, sometimes it just doesn't make any sense. It's like any tool, it's only as good as the person using it.
Yeah, absolutely. As a tool,
all right.
Does have some interesting potential.
I talked a little bit about, it's very clear, I think, for me at least, where it could go when you pair it with image recognition, when you pair it with some of these other pieces, how, I went down a 2-month really concerning rabbit hole about self-worth and all these other things, and you're like, oh, God, an AI, and then you start to realize, it's a tool like any other tool. Yep. In the last couple minutes, what's something in the world of testing that you want to bring up, that you find interesting, that you're kind of contemplating in today's world?
There's a very interesting movement about a move from testers into quality coaching and quality engineering at the moment as well, and I'd like to see where that ends up. I think it's an interesting idea. So you're kind of coaching quality into the team, and it's kind of like being very proactive, but I do wonder with a lot of these coaching positions, if you're moving yourself out of the delivery pipeline, is it just going to be like a flash in the pan only, and we'll go back to traditional testing eventually, or will it? Is this something that's going to be around for a long time? I don't know if you're familiar with the quality coaching or quality engineering movement, I guess, called at the moment, but
define it for me a little bit. Are developers falling under this, or what's the overall scope of this coach's role?
It's one of these funny things, is if you ask 2 people who are involved with quality coaching or quality engineering what it is, you'll get 3 different answers. But from what I can tell, it's about it's either helping developers and the rest of the project team to test and assess and evaluate the quality of their methods and processes more, or it's just management, basically. Just another way of talking about management. Someone who can define processes, metrics, and help with decision making, that kind of thing. So those are the main 2 definitions I've come up with myself, or I've come across, I should say.
Very, very large question for about 90 seconds. Do you believe developers should be doing all of the automation, some of the automation, QA? Because that is another trend that just made me think about, is QA becoming more advisory while developers are doing more of the automation and all of the automation, and that kind of seems a little hand in hand. Is that linked, not linked? Am I just making that up?
I think that'll be part of it as well. Coaching the developers to focus more on automated tests and unit tests, that kind of thing. I think the best way is to have developers and testers working more closely together. So developers aren't working in isolation, testers aren't working in isolation, but developers and testers come together to write automated tests and do exploratory testing or any other kind of testing on the app itself. I think it's that collaboration, both bringing their expertise to the table, working closely together, and that's the best way to go, I'll say.
I think that's a fantastic spot to end on. So, Ben Fellows, I appreciate it. I think we have proven that there are multiple dimensions of the world that have collided
Yeah,
together. I thank you for
absolutely.
joining.
Thank you, Ben Fellows. Pleasure to be here.
Talk soon.
Bye.
All right.